The NotPetya apocalypse, the $10 billion cyber attack that almost broke the world. June 27, 2017, 10:30 a.m. A single line of malicious code detonates across the globe. Within 60 seconds, shipping containers freeze mid-ocean. Hospitals lose patient records. Chocolate factories go dark. Banks lock their vaults. FedEx stops delivering. Pharmaceutical giants can't manufacture life-saving drugs. The entire country of Ukraine loses power to government systems. And at the epicenter of it all, a Danish shipping company watching $350 million evaporate in real time as 49,000 computers simultaneously commit digital suicide. This isn't science fiction. This is NotPetya. And you've never heard the full story until right now. Picture this. You're sitting in a corner office in Copenhagen, overlooking the harbor where massive container ships bearing your company's name dominate the skyline. You're the CEO of Maersk, the largest shipping company on planet Earth. Your fleet moves 1 in 5 containers worldwide. You control the arteries of global commerce. Your phone rings. Then another. Then 10 more simultaneously. Your IT director bursts through the door, face pale, hands shaking. "We've been hit," he says. "Everything's gone." Gone. What does that even mean? It means that in the time it took you to blink, 18% of the world's shipping capacity just vanished into the digital void. It means port terminals from Los Angeles to Rotterdam are now operating with pen and paper. It means 76 ports across the globe have become expensive parking lots for ships that can't unload their cargo because the computers that tell crane operators what to move, where to move it, and who owns it have been turned into very expensive paperweights. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. Maersk wasn't the target. They were collateral damage. And so were the hundreds of other companies that fell that day. Because NotPetya wasn't designed to steal money. It wasn't built to hold data hostage. It was engineered for one purpose and one purpose only: total, irreversible destruction. And it worked beyond anyone's wildest nightmares. Welcome to the most expensive cyber attack in human history. A digital weapon so devastating that it rewrote every rule we thought we knew about cybersecurity. A story so complex, so layered with international intrigue, corporate catastrophe, and technological terror that Hollywood couldn't make it up if they tried. I'm about to take you deep inside the anatomy of a digital apocalypse. We're going to walk through the corridors of power in Moscow, where this nightmare was born. We'll stand in Ukrainian tax offices the moment the virus detonated. We'll watch in real time as it spread faster than any biological pandemic ever could, crossing oceans, penetrating the world's most secure networks, and leaving a trail of destruction that would take years to fully calculate. By the end of this story, you'll understand why cybersecurity experts consider NotPetya the most significant cyber event in history. You'll see how a single compromised software update in Kyiv became the match that lit a $10 billion inferno. You'll learn the shocking truth about how modern warfare has evolved into something far more insidious than bombs and bullets. But most importantly, you'll discover why every expert agrees on one chilling fact. NotPetya wasn't the end of this story. It was a proof of concept, a test run. A glimpse into a future where the next global crisis won't come from a missile silo or a terrorist cell, but from a keyboard in a basement somewhere, operated by someone you'll never see, never catch, and never stop until it's too late. This is the story of how the world almost broke, and why it can happen again tomorrow. Are you ready? Because once we go down this rabbit hole, you'll never look at your computer the same way again. To understand NotPetya, we need to rewind to a conflict most people barely noticed. A war that's been raging since 2014, fought not just with tanks and artillery, but with ones and zeros. February 2014. Russian forces, officially unidentified armed men. But let's be honest about who they really were. seize Crimea from Ukraine. The world condemns it. Sanctions flow. Diplomats issue stern warnings. But behind the scenes, another war begins. A digital shadow war that would make the physical conflict look like a playground scuffle. Ukraine becomes the testing ground for a new kind of warfare. Russian state-sponsored hacking groups, names you might have heard whispered in cybersecurity circles, Sandworm, Fancy Bear, APT-28, begin systematically attacking Ukrainian infrastructure. And I don't mean they're stealing passwords or defacing websites. I mean they're going after the foundations of modern civilization. December 2015. Western Ukraine. It's cold, dark, 2 days before Christmas. Families are gathering for holiday celebrations. Children are excited about presents. And then, the lights go out. Not just in one home, or one street, or even one neighborhood. 230,000 people lose power simultaneously. Initially, authorities think it's equipment failure. Happens all the time in winter, right? Except this time, when engineers try to restore power, they can't. The systems won't respond. Control centers are locked out of their own equipment. And here's the truly creepy part. As technicians frantically try to regain control, they watch their cursors moving across screens, operated by someone else. Someone far away. Someone who's watching them panic in real time. The hackers had been inside the power grid for months. They'd studied every system, every backup, every failsafe. When they struck, they didn't just cut the power. They destroyed the industrial control systems that manage it. They wiped the masters that would allow restoration. They even disabled the backup communication systems so operators couldn't coordinate a response. This was black energy, the first successful cyber attack on a power grid in history. But it was just the opening act. 1 year later, December 2016, they do it again. This time they're more sophisticated, more devastating. They deploy a malware variant called Indestroyer, specifically designed to manipulate electrical substation switches and circuit breakers. This isn't some general-purpose virus adapted for the task. This is a precision weapon, custom-built to speak the language of industrial control systems, crafted by people who understand power grid operations at an engineering level. But between these two power grid attacks, something else happens. Something that would plant the seeds for NotPetya. Throughout 2016, Ukrainian businesses, banks, airports, railways, and government agencies face a relentless barrage of attacks. Not ransomware asking for money. Not hackers stealing data. Destructive attacks designed to cripple, to create chaos, to destabilize. And the Russian hackers, particularly a group, the NSA, codenamed Sandworm, learned something crucial. The best way into these organizations isn't through their firewalls. It's through their software supply chain. Every company uses accounting software, right? In Ukraine, there's one that dominates, MEDOC. Think of it like TurboTax or QuickBooks, but for Ukrainian businesses. It's mandatory for filing taxes with the government. Every major company uses it. Law firms, banks, utilities, government contractors. It's so embedded in Ukrainian business infrastructure that not having it means you literally cannot operate legally. And Sandworm noticed. Throughout late 2016 and early 2017, Russian hackers systematically compromised MEDOC. Not with some flashy, obvious hack. This is patient, methodical infiltration. They get inside the company's servers. They study how the software update mechanism works. They position themselves to deliver malicious updates to MEDOC's 45,000 customers whenever they choose. But they're not ready to strike yet, because what they're building isn't just another destructive attack. They're engineering something unprecedented, a weapon that would combine the most dangerous elements of every cyber attack that came before it, wrapped in camouflage so convincing that by the time anyone realized what was happening, it would already be too late to stop. They're building NotPetya, and they're about to test it on Ukraine before unleashing it on a completely unsuspecting world. Let's talk about what makes NotPetya different from every cyber attack that came before it. Because on the surface, when it first detonated, it looked like ransomware. It encrypted your files, displayed a ransom note demanding $300 in Bitcoin, gave you instructions for payment. Classic ransomware playbook, right? Except for one crucial, terrifying detail. There was no way to decrypt your files even if you paid. The payment mechanism didn't work. The decryption keys didn't exist. The email address to contact the attackers? It was shut down within hours by the email provider. This wasn't ransomware. It was a data-destroying missile disguised as ransomware. And that disguise was intentional, designed to cause maximum confusion during the critical first hours when companies would be deciding how to respond. But the really genius, truly diabolical part of NotPetya was how it spread. Most malware needs you to do something stupid. Click a suspicious link. Open a sketchy attachment. Download something you shouldn't. NotPetya didn't need any of that. Once it got inside a network, once just one computer was infected, it became completely self-propagating. The architects of NotPetya took hacking tools that the NSA had developed and that had been leaked to the public just months earlier, exploit frameworks called Eternal Blue and Eternal Romance. These weren't your garden variety hacks. These were weapons-grade exploitation tools that targeted vulnerabilities in Windows networking protocols, vulnerabilities so fundamental that they existed in nearly every version of Windows ever shipped. Microsoft had actually released patches for these vulnerabilities in March 2017, 3 months before NotPetya. But here's the thing about patches. Companies don't install them immediately. IT departments worry about compatibility. They test. They wait. They procrastinate. Studies show that even critical security patches take an average of 30 to 45 days to deploy across corporate networks. Some companies never deploy them at all. Sandworm knew this. They counted on it. But even if your network was fully patched against Eternal Blue and Eternal Romance, NotPetya had backup methods. It could steal administrator credentials using a tool called Mimikatz. It could spread through standard Windows networking protocols using legitimate system administration tools like PSExec and WMIC. It moved through networks the way a legitimate IT administrator would, which made it incredibly difficult to detect or stop. Think about that for a second. This malware could spread through your network using the exact same tools your IT department uses every day. It could steal credentials, move laterally between systems, and infect every machine it could reach, all while looking like routine administrative activity. And once it infected a computer, it didn't just encrypt your files. It targeted the master boot record, the fundamental code that tells your computer how to start up. It destroyed the master file table, the directory that keeps track of where all your files are stored on the hard drive. It overwrote these with random data, making recovery impossible even with professional forensic tools. In technical terms, what NotPetya did was render infected computers permanently inoperable. Your data wasn't encrypted and held for ransom. It was destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. Your computer wasn't locked. It was dead. But here's what elevates NotPetya from merely devastating to historically apocalyptic: the delivery mechanism. June 27, 2017, around 10:30 a.m. Kyiv time. MEDoc, that accounting software I mentioned earlier, pushed out a routine software update. 45,000 Ukrainian businesses, most of them sitting behind robust firewalls, protected by expensive security systems, vigilantly guarded by IT departments, downloaded and installed an update from a trusted vendor. And in that single moment, 45,000 Ukrainian organizations simultaneously infected themselves. This is called a supply chain attack, and it's the nightmare scenario that keeps cybersecurity professionals awake at night. Because how do you defend against your own trusted software turning against you? How do you protect your network when the attack comes through the front door? invited in by your own systems. You can't. Within seconds of that update installing, NotPetya began executing. It spread through local networks at lightning speed. It jumped from Ukraine to international companies with Ukrainian operations. And because the world is more connected than we like to think, because multinational corporations operate globally interconnected networks, because shipping companies and pharmaceutical manufacturers and law firms all link their offices together for efficiency, NotPetya didn't stay in Ukraine. It escaped. And when it escaped, it became the most expensive cyber attack in human history. Let's follow the infection path of one company to understand how quickly this escalated from a regional attack to a global catastrophe. We're going to start with Maersk, because their story is the most comprehensively documented and, frankly, the most terrifying. AP Maersk. If you don't know the name, you've almost certainly used their services without knowing it. They're the largest container shipping company on Earth. Their ships move 18 million containers annually. They handle roughly 20% of the world's shipping capacity. They employ 76,000 people across 130 countries. On June 27, 2017, Maersk had a small IT operation in Ukraine, just a regional office handling local logistics and operations. That office used MEDOC. At 10:30 a.m. Kyiv time, that office downloaded the poisoned update. What happened next unfolded with the speed and inevitability of a runaway train. NotPetya infected the Ukrainian computers. Within minutes, it had spread to every machine on the local network. But Maersk, like most modern corporations, operates a unified global network. Every office, every terminal, every operations center worldwide is connected through corporate VPN infrastructure. It allows for seamless communication, real-time data sharing, coordinated logistics across continents. It also meant that NotPetya had a highway to everywhere Maersk operated. At 10:35 a.m., 5 minutes after initial infection, NotPetya reached Maersk's headquarters in Copenhagen. By 10:40, it had spread to their Americas operations. By 10:45, it was in Asia. Within an hour, it had infected systems in India, Brazil, Spain, Ireland, the Netherlands, Peru, Ecuador, Argentina, Belgium, Guatemala, Chile, all 76 Maersk port terminals worldwide. The speed is hard to comprehend. This wasn't a slow-spreading virus that gave IT departments time to react. This was a digital tsunami moving at the speed of light through fiber optic cables, jumping between continents in milliseconds, infecting thousands of computers every minute. Jim Hagemann-Snape, chairman of Maersk's parent company, would later describe watching it unfold. We saw our screens going black one by one, first in one country, then another, then another. It was like watching dominoes fall, except these dominoes were our entire global IT infrastructure, and they were falling faster than we could count. At port terminals from Rotterdam to Los Angeles, from Mumbai to Algeciras, the same scene repeated. Computer screens displayed the ransom message. But the real damage was invisible to the people staring at those screens. Behind that message, every piece of data on those computers was being systematically destroyed. Customer shipment data, gone. Container locations, gone. Cargo manifests, gone. Loading schedules, gone. Crane operation systems, gone. Gate security systems, gone. Everything that told Maersk where 18 million containers were, what was in them, who owned them, where they were going, how to move them, gone. 76 port terminals, handling roughly 45 million tons of cargo annually, suddenly reverted to pre-computer operations. Except nobody remembered how to do pre-computer operations anymore. The institutional knowledge was gone. The paper forms didn't exist. The procedures had been digitized decades ago. Imagine showing up to LAX and being told that every flight schedule, every ticket, every passenger manifest is gone, and by the way, We need you to manually sort out 60,000 passengers using paper and pencil. Now multiply that chaos by every major port on the planet simultaneously. Ships arrived, but couldn't unload because the terminal systems that tell crane operators what to move were dead. Trucks showed up to collect containers, but couldn't because the gate systems that verify pickups were destroyed. Cargo sat in terminals, unclaimed and untrackable, while companies desperately tried to figure out if their shipments were in Los Angeles or Lagos. Maersk later estimated they were moving 1,000 containers per day across their global network compared to a normal volume of 50,000. That's 98% operational capacity lost. For a company whose entire business is moving things, that's not a disruption. That's near total shutdown. But here's what makes this even more devastating. Maersk's backup systems were connected to the same network. Their disaster recovery infrastructure? Infected. Their backup data centers? Compromised. Their redundancy systems designed to prevent exactly this scenario? All dead. There was one exception. One single domain controller, one server in Ghana, survived. Why? Because a power outage in Ghana had knocked that server offline minutes before NotPetya reached it. When power was restored, that server came back online to find itself the last functioning domain controller in Maersk's entire global network. Think about that. A random power outage in West Africa was the only thing that allowed Maersk to eventually rebuild their network. If not for that coincidence, they would have had to reconstruct their entire global IT infrastructure from scratch with no reference point, no backup, no roadmap. Experts estimate that could have taken 6 months to a year. The company might not have survived. And remember, as catastrophic as this was for Maersk, they weren't alone. While Maersk was watching their shipping empire grind to a halt, the same nightmare was unfolding across dozens of other major corporations simultaneously. Let's talk about the other victims, because Maersk, as devastating as their situation was, represented just one industry vertical. NotPetya was indiscriminate in its destruction, cutting across every sector of the global economy. FedEx, specifically their TNT Express division, a European delivery service FedEx had acquired for $4.8 billion just 2 years earlier. TNT had operations in Ukraine. They used MEDOC. At 10:30 a.m. on June 27th, they downloaded the same poisoned update. Within hours, TNT's entire operational infrastructure collapsed. Tracking systems went dark. Sorting facilities had no idea what packages were where. Delivery trucks left depots with paper manifests, working blind, trying to deliver packages based on memory and guesswork. Customer service couldn't answer questions about shipments because all shipment data was destroyed. Unlike Maersk, FedEx had insurance. They would later file a claim for $300 million in losses. The insurance company refused to pay, arguing that NotPetya constituted an act of war and was therefore excluded from coverage. That legal battle continues to this day, 6 years later, raising profound questions about how we classify cyber warfare and whether traditional insurance frameworks can even function in the age of state-sponsored cyberattacks. The immediate operational impact for TNT? They essentially lost an entire quarter. 3 months of barely functional operations. Customer defection. Market share erosion. Brand damage. And even after spending hundreds of millions on recovery, TNT never fully regained the operational efficiency they had before NotPetya struck. Merck, one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, maker of drugs like Keytruda for cancer treatment, vaccines including Gardasil and the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. They had operations in Ukraine. You know where this is going. NotPetya infected Merck's network through their Ukrainian offices. Within hours, it had spread to 30,000 computers across their global operations. Manufacturing facilities shut down. Research labs lost data. Their Gardasil vaccine production, which protects against HPV-related cancers, was severely disrupted, creating global vaccine shortages. Merck would later testify before Congress that NotPetya cost them $870 million in damages. $870 million from a single malware infection. That's more than the GDP of some small countries. But the pharmaceutical industry impact extended beyond just Merck. Reckitt Kaiser, the company that makes Lysol, got hit. Their production facilities went offline. During the following flu season, there were global shortages of disinfectant products because manufacturing had been interrupted. Cadbury chocolate factories in Tasmania went dark. Yes, you read that correctly. A Russian cyberattack on Ukraine caused chocolate factories on an island south of Australia to shut down. That's how interconnected our world has become. That's how far NotPetya spread. Rosneft, one of Russia's largest oil companies, got hit. The irony is almost poetic. A Russian state-sponsored attack ended up infecting Russian oil infrastructure. Rosneft's CEO went on television claiming they'd successfully repelled the attack, except their gas stations across Russia couldn't process credit card payments, and their website displayed the ransom message. But sure, successfully repelled. Saint-Gobain, a French construction materials company, $384 million in damages. Mondelez International, the company that makes Oreos and Ritz crackers, $100 million in damages. Bayersdorf, the company behind Nivea, they got hit. Nuance Communications, speech recognition software used in medical dictation, hit. Their product was offline for weeks, causing chaos in hospitals trying to transcribe medical records. Heritage Valley Health System in Pennsylvania, an American hospital network with no operations in Ukraine, no direct connection to MEDOC, got infected because they had some connection, somewhere in their network, to an entity that had been compromised. Their electronic health record system crashed. Surgeries were delayed. Ambulances were diverted to other hospitals. Patient care was directly impacted. Law firms, including some of the world's most prestigious legal practices, got hit. Client files, case documents, privileged communications, all encrypted and destroyed. DLA Piper, one of the world's largest law firms, had to tell their clients that confidential legal files might be compromised. The professional liability and reputational damage was incalculable. Accounting firms got hit. Advertising agencies got hit. Universities got hit. Government agencies across Europe got hit. The list goes on. And here's the crucial thing to understand. Many companies never publicly disclosed they were affected. We know about Maersk, FedEx, Merck, and the others because they're publicly traded companies required to disclose material impacts to shareholders, or because they filed insurance claims, or because journalists investigated and reported it. But how many privately held companies got hit and never said anything? How many small businesses had their data destroyed and just quietly went under? How many victims suffered in silence because admitting to a cyberattack felt like admitting to incompetence, or because they feared the reputational damage? When cyber insurance companies and security researchers try to calculate the total cost of NotPetya, they're working with incomplete data. The estimates range from $10 billion to $15 billion, but the truth is, nobody knows the real number. It's probably higher. Possibly much higher. And those are just the direct costs. Companies spending money on recovery, on new hardware, on overtime for IT staff working around the clock, on lost revenue during downtime. What about the indirect costs? The deals that fell through because companies couldn't communicate with clients? The contracts lost because competitors took advantage of the chaos? The employees who lost jobs because their companies couldn't recover? The medications that weren't produced because pharmaceutical factories were offline? The supply chain disruptions that rippled through entire industries? You can't put a dollar figure on those impacts. They're real, they caused suffering, but they're invisible in the spreadsheets that calculate cost of cyberattack. In the immediate aftermath, as companies were still frantically trying to recover, the question everyone was asking was, who did this? The ransom message was in English. The Bitcoin payment mechanism, despite being fake, was structured like other ransomware. Some early security researchers thought this might be a ransomware campaign gone wrong, or possibly the work of cybercriminals trying to make money. But that theory fell apart almost immediately. Real ransomware operators want to get paid. They need their payment systems to work. They need to maintain a reputation for actually decrypting files after payment so future victims believe paying might work. NotPetya's attackers did none of this. The payment mechanism was obviously broken. The decryption was impossible. This wasn't a get-rich scheme. This was pure destruction. Within 48 hours, cybersecurity researchers began piecing together the truth. The payload was too sophisticated, too specifically engineered. The delivery mechanism through MEDOC required months of preparation. The timing, detonating on the eve of Ukraine's Constitution Day, a major national holiday, was too symbolic to be coincidental. This was Sandworm, Russian military intelligence unit, specifically GRU Unit 74455, the same group behind the 2015 and 2016 power grid attacks, the same team that had been systematically attacking Ukrainian infrastructure for years. The technical evidence was overwhelming. Code similarities to previous Sandworm attacks. Infrastructure overlaps. The MEDOC compromise showed the same operational patterns as earlier GRU operations. When Western intelligence agencies analyzed NotPetya, they reached unanimous conclusions. This was Russia. This was military. This was intentional. In February 2018, 8 months after NotPetya, the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand jointly attributed the attack to the Russian military. Not hackers with loose ties to Russia. Not patriotic volunteers. The actual Russian military. Official government statement naming Russia's GRU as the perpetrator. In October 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted 6 GRU officers by name for NotPetya and other attacks. The indictment read like a spy thriller. Yuri Sergeyevich Andrienko, Sergei Vladimirovich Dedistov, Pavel Valeryevich Frolov, Anatoly Sergeyevich Kovalev, Artem Valeryevich Ochichenko, Petr Nikolaevich Pliskin. 6 men, sitting in office buildings in Moscow, who engineered the most expensive cyber attack in history. They'll never stand trial. Russia doesn't extradite its intelligence officers. But now we know their names. We know their faces. We know which unit they work for. The indictment included forensic detail about their operations, their methods, their infrastructure. It was the most comprehensive public disclosure of state-sponsored hacking operations ever released. And here's what that disclosure revealed. NotPetya wasn't some rogue operation or unauthorized attack by overzealous hackers. This was planned, resourced, and executed by a military unit with full state backing, meaning the Russian government made a deliberate decision to deploy a cyber weapon with global reach, knowing it would cause massive collateral damage, and did it anyway. The stated target was Ukraine. The goal was to destabilize, to punish Ukraine for resisting Russian influence, to demonstrate that Ukraine couldn't protect its own infrastructure, to create chaos that would undermine faith in Ukrainian institutions. But the architects of NotPetya knew it would spread beyond Ukraine. They had to know. The exploit tools they used, the self-propagating worm capabilities, the way it leveraged global corporate networks. None of that makes sense if you're trying to contain an attack to one country. Either they grossly underestimated how far it would spread, which seems unlikely for an elite military hacking unit, or they knew it would spread and decided the geopolitical benefits of attacking Ukraine outweighed the global economic damage. Think about that cost-benefit analysis. Russia decided that hitting Ukraine was worth potentially causing billions in damage to global commerce. including to their own companies, their own allies, neutral countries, anyone and everyone caught in the blast radius. That calculation reveals something chilling about how Russia views cyber warfare. They're willing to deploy digital weapons with global impact, with unpredictable and uncontrollable spread, with the potential to cause massive collateral damage to uninvolved parties, and they see that as acceptable. This isn't traditional warfare where you can aim a bomb at a military target and civilian casualties are tragic but unintended. This is more like releasing a biological weapon that you know will spread far beyond your intended target and shrugging your shoulders about the consequences. And here's the really scary part. There were no meaningful consequences for Russia. Some countries issued strong statements. Sanctions were discussed, but never meaningfully implemented. The United Nations talked about norms of behavior in cyberspace, but Russia faced no real punishment, no military retaliation, no economic penalties proportional to the damage caused, nothing that would deter them from doing something similar again. From Russia's perspective, NotPetya was probably considered a success. They hurt Ukraine badly. They demonstrated their cyber capabilities to the world. They caused chaos in the West. And the cost to them. Some American prosecutors indicted some guys who will never set foot in an American courtroom. That's not a deterrent. That's a cost of doing business. Now let's talk about what it took for these companies to recover, because this is where the story gets even more insane. Remember, NotPetya didn't just lock files. It destroyed the underlying systems that make computers work. Companies couldn't just pay a ransom or wait for a decryption tool. They had to rebuild everything from scratch. Maersk's recovery is the most extensively documented, so let's walk through their nightmare. They had 49,000 computers infected, not 49,000 files. 49,000 entire computers. Desktop workstations, servers, laptops, everything. Every single one was completely dead. Wouldn't boot. Couldn't be recovered with any known tools. Their backup systems were infected. Disaster recovery infrastructure was gone. The documented procedures for rebuilding their network? Those were stored on infected systems too. They had to fly a domain controller, that one server from Ghana that survived, from West Africa to Europe. Physically put it on a plane because they didn't trust their network infrastructure. Then they used that single server as the foundation to rebuild their entire global Active Directory infrastructure. But they didn't just need to rebuild IT systems. They needed to do it fast. Every day their terminals weren't operational cost them millions in lost revenue and damaged customer relationships. Competitors were circling, offering to take over their contracts. The entire company was bleeding out financially. So they made a crazy decision. They would rebuild their entire global IT infrastructure in 10 days. 10 days to replace and reconfigure 49,000 computers. 10 days to rebuild their network architecture. 10 days to restore data from uninfected backup tapes, manually verify it was clean, and load it into new systems. 10 days to get 76 port terminals across the globe operational again. It was an impossible timeline. IT projects of this scale normally take months, even years. Rebuilding after a disaster, where you've lost your documentation and your institutional knowledge, usually takes even longer. The team Maersk assembled for this worked in human hours. IT staff from every time zone, coordinated in marathon round-the-clock shifts. At one point, they were installing 4,000 computers per day. They chartered planes to fly new hardware to remote locations. They had engineers sleeping in data centers because going home would waste time. Teams worked in parallel across the globe. While European teams were rebuilding terminals in Rotterdam, American teams were doing the same in Los Angeles, Asian teams in Mumbai, Latin American teams in Buenos Aires. They communicated through whatever channels still worked because their normal collaboration tools were dead. And they had to do all of this while running a shipping company. Ships still needed to be loaded and unloaded. even if they had to do it with pen and paper. Customers still needed to be serviced, even if that meant answering every question with, "I don't know. Our systems are down." Against all odds, they did it. 10 days after NotPetya hit, Maersk had their core systems operational. Not fully functional, not restored to normal, but working enough to resume operations. Over the following weeks and months, they continued rebuilding, refining, restoring capabilities. The final cost for Maersk? $350 million. That's the cost they publicly disclosed to shareholders. It covered new hardware, overtime for staff, consultants brought in to help, lost revenue during downtime. It didn't include harder-to-quantify costs like damaged customer relationships or market share loss to competitors. FedEx's recovery took longer. TNT Express struggled for months. Some of their systems never fully returned to pre-attack efficiency. They were still discovering encrypted files years later, buried in forgotten network shares, time bombs waiting to cause problems when someone tried to access them. Merck's recovery was complicated by the nature of pharmaceutical manufacturing. You can't just restart a production line that makes life-saving drugs. Everything has to be validated, tested, certified for quality and safety. Restarting after NotPetya meant revalidating entire production processes, which added months to their recovery timeline. Smaller companies faced even worse challenges. They didn't have Maersk's resources or Merck's army of IT professionals. Many small and medium businesses hit by NotPetya simply restored from backups if they had them, or started over if they didn't. Some went out of business entirely. And here's a question nobody wants to think about. How many companies compromised their security in the rush to recover? When you're rebuilding 49,000 computers in 10 days, are you taking the time to implement security best practices? Or are you cutting corners to get operational? How many of the recovered networks had security gaps that wouldn't be discovered until the next attack? The desperation of the recovery phase created opportunities for further compromise. Companies were so focused on getting back online that security was often an afterthought. Cybersecurity experts worry that some NotPetya victims may have rebuilt on insecure foundations, leaving themselves vulnerable to future attacks. Here's where the story takes another dark turn. Many of these companies thought they were protected. They had cybersecurity insurance, policies that covered exactly this scenario: cyberattack causing operational disruption and financial loss. FedEx's TNT Express had coverage through Zurich Insurance. They filed a claim for $300 million. Zurich refused to pay. Their argument? The policy had a war exclusion clause. Traditional insurance policies exclude acts of war because war is considered an uninsurable risk. No insurance company could remain solvent if they had to cover the full costs of war. Zurich argued that NotPetya, being attributed to the Russian military, was an act of war, therefore the war exclusion applied, therefore they didn't have to pay. FedEx argued that NotPetya was cyberterrorism, cybercrime, cyberattack, pick your term, but not war in the traditional sense. No kinetic weapons, no battlefield, no formal declaration of war. The insurance policy's war exclusion was written for traditional conflicts: bombs, missiles, troops. It wasn't written with cyberattacks in mind. This case is still in litigation, but the implications are staggering. If insurance companies can successfully argue that state-sponsored cyberattacks are acts of war, then cybersecurity insurance becomes essentially worthless for the scenarios where you need it most. Think about it. The attacks most likely to cause catastrophic damage are state-sponsored attacks. NotPetya, WannaCry, Stuxnet, the big ones that make headlines and cause billions in damage. Those are all state-sponsored. If insurance doesn't cover state-sponsored attacks because of war exclusions, what exactly is cybersecurity insurance protecting you against? Script kiddies? Petty criminals? The least threatening actors in the threat landscape? Mondelez, The Oreo and Ritz Cracker Company also had coverage through Zurich. They filed an insurance claim. Zurich refused to pay using the same war exclusion argument. Mondelez sued. That case also continues. These legal battles are defining the future of cyber insurance. Courts will eventually have to decide, is a cyber attack by a nation-state's military an act of war even if it occurs during peacetime and targets civilian infrastructure? Does attribution matter? If the attack comes from Russia but targets Ukraine with America as collateral damage, is that war against America? And here's the uncomfortable reality. The insurance industry doesn't have good answers. War exclusions in insurance policies were written decades ago for a different world, a different type of conflict. Nobody thought about cyber attacks when these clauses were drafted. Now lawyers on both sides are fighting over how to interpret 70-year-old policy language in the context of 21st century cyber warfare. Some insurance companies are now rewriting their policies to explicitly address cyber warfare. They're adding specific exclusions for state-sponsored attacks, which again raises the question, what's the point of the insurance? Other insurers are offering tiered coverage, basic policies that exclude state-sponsored attacks, premium policies that cover some state-sponsored scenarios, but with sub-limits and high deductibles. The pricing is astronomical because actuaries have no idea how to calculate the risk. How do you price insurance for an attack like NotPetya? What's the probability of another one happening? What would the damage cost be? Nobody knows. The entire cyber insurance market is in existential crisis. Before NotPetya, it was a growing market with optimistic projections. After NotPetya, insurance companies realized they were potentially exposed to unlimited liability from state actors with no constraints on their behavior. That's not a sustainable business model. Some major insurers have stopped offering standalone cyber policies altogether. Others have dramatically reduced their coverage limits. The companies that still offer comprehensive coverage charge premiums so high that only the largest corporations can afford them. And smaller companies, the ones that probably need insurance most because they can't absorb a major loss, are priced out of the market entirely. This creates perverse incentives. Without insurance, companies are less likely to invest in cybersecurity because why spend money on prevention if you can't insure against the risk anyway? But less investment in cybersecurity makes attacks more likely and more damaging. It's a doom spiral. The NotPetya insurance debacle revealed a fundamental problem with how we think about cyber risk. Traditional insurance models don't work when the risk includes state-sponsored attacks with billion-dollar price tags. We need new frameworks, new types of coverage, possibly government backstops similar to terrorism insurance pools. But we don't have those yet. Right now, companies are largely self-insuring against cyber risk, which means when the next NotPetya hits, they're on their own. So what did we learn from NotPetya? What changed in the aftermath of the most expensive cyber attack in history? The depressing answer is, not nearly enough. Let's start with software patching. Remember how NotPetya spread using exploits that Microsoft had patched 3 months before the attack? Eternal Blue and Eternal Romance. Those patches were available. They were free. Installing them would have prevented NotPetya from spreading through networks. And yet, organizations didn't install them. Even after NotPetya, even after seeing billions in damages caused by unpatched systems, the patching problem persists. Studies conducted years after NotPetya found that 30 to 40% of organizations still had systems vulnerable to Eternal Blue, the exact exploit that caused the NotPetya pandemic. Why? Because patching is hard. It requires coordination. It requires testing. It risks breaking something. IT departments are overworked and understaffed. Patching falls down the priority list behind keeping systems running and dealing with user complaints. But here's the thing. Not patching is accepting risk. Every unpatched vulnerability is a door left unlocked. And as NotPetya proved, Attackers will walk through those doors. What about supply chain security? NotPetya entered through a trusted software vendor. MEDoc was a legitimate company providing a legitimate product. Companies trusted them, and that trust was exploited. After NotPetya, you'd think companies would be paranoid about supply chain security, right? Vetting their vendors? Monitoring software updates? Implementing defense in-depth strategies? Some did. Most didn't. Supply chain attacks have continued and accelerated since NotPetya. SolarWinds in 2020, where Russian hackers compromised network monitoring software and infected thousands of organizations, including multiple U.S. government agencies. Kaseya in 2021, where ransomware operators compromised IT management software to hit 1,500 companies simultaneously. The pattern is clear. Compromise the supply chain. Infect everyone downstream. NotPetya proved this works. Subsequent attacks prove that companies still haven't figured out how to defend against it. What about network segmentation? One of the reasons NotPetya spread so catastrophically was because corporate networks were flat. Once the malware got inside, it could reach everything. Maersk's Ukrainian office was connected directly to their global network. No barriers, no checkpoints, no containment zones. Best practice cybersecurity says you should segment your network. Different regions, different functions, different security zones should be isolated from each other. If one segment gets infected, the damage stays contained. It's like having watertight compartments on a ship. One compartment floods, the ship stays afloat. But network segmentation is expensive and complex. It makes things less convenient. Users complain about having to log in multiple times or not being able to access systems as easily. So companies don't do it, or they implement partial segmentation that doesn't actually stop attacks. 6 years after NotPetya, most corporate networks still lack effective segmentation, which means the next worm-style attack will spread just as fast and just as far as NotPetya did. What about backup systems? Every company says they have backups, but NotPetya proved that having backups and having effective backups are different things. Backups that are connected to your primary network aren't backups. They're just more targets for the malware. Effective backup strategy requires air-gapped backups, offline storage, tape systems that malware can't reach through the network. And you need to test your backups regularly. Can you actually restore from them? How long does it take? Do they contain everything you need? Most companies don't have truly isolated backups. Most companies don't regularly test their restoration procedures. They assume their backups work, and then when disaster strikes, they discover their assumptions were wrong. What about attribution and deterrence? We know who did NotPetya. We've indicted them by name, and they face zero consequences. They're still working for the GRU. They're probably still conducting operations, because Russia doesn't care about American indictments. If there's no punishment for causing $10 billion in global damage, why wouldn't they do it again? Why wouldn't other countries look at Russia's experience and think, hey, cyber warfare is pretty effective and there are no real consequences? China is watching. North Korea is watching. Iran is watching. Every country with cyber capabilities is learning the same lesson. You can attack with relative impunity as long as you avoid crossing some undefined red line that might trigger kinetic retaliation. The international community has utterly failed to establish meaningful norms or consequences for cyber warfare. We have Geneva Conventions for traditional warfare. We have treaties governing weapons of mass destruction. But for cyber? Nothing enforceable. Nothing with teeth. Just aspirational statements and toothless condemnations. The sad reality is that NotPetya changed very little. Companies are still vulnerable in the same ways. Attackers are still using the same techniques. Governments are still failing to deter or punish cyber warfare. We learned what we needed to do to prevent the next NotPetya, and then collectively decided it was too hard, too expensive, or too inconvenient to actually do those things. Which brings us to the scariest part of this story. NotPetya wasn't the end. It was a preview. Let's talk about what's happened in the cybersecurity threat landscape since NotPetya, because if you think things have gotten better, you haven't been paying attention. NotPetya proved several things to the world's hackers, both criminal and state-sponsored. It proved that supply chain attacks work. It proved that worm-style malware can spread globally in hours. It proved that you can cause billions in damage without sophisticated zero-day exploits, just by weaponizing known vulnerabilities that organizations haven't patched. And perhaps most importantly, it proved that even attacks causing massive global damage don't trigger serious retaliation. Every adversary learned these lessons. SolarWinds, I mentioned it earlier, but let's dive deeper. Russian intelligence agency SVR, a different agency than the GRU that did NotPetya, compromised SolarWinds Orion, network monitoring software used by thousands of organizations. They inserted a backdoor into a legitimate software update. When companies installed that update, they were installing Russian espionage tools. The breach went undetected for months. During that time, Russian intelligence had access to U.S. government agencies, Fortune 500 companies, cybersecurity firms, essentially anyone using SolarWinds. They could read emails, steal data, map networks, establish persistence for future operations. This was NotPetya's supply chain attack playbook applied to espionage instead of destruction. Same concept, different goal. And just like MEDOC, the compromise happened at the trusted vendor level, making it nearly impossible for customers to detect. The Casio attack in 2021 combined supply chain compromise with ransomware. The REvil ransomware group hacked Casio VSA, IT management software used by managed service providers. MSPs use tools like Casio to manage their clients' IT systems. One MSP might manage 50 or 100 client companies. By compromising Casio, REvil could push ransomware through MSPs to all their clients simultaneously. It was supply chain attack inception. They attacked the supply chain of the supply chain. Approximately 1,500 companies were hit. Most were small to medium businesses who never made headlines, but the aggregate damage was immense. This is the evolution NotPetya triggered. Attackers realized that compromising one vendor lets you attack hundreds or thousands of targets downstream. Why hack 100 companies individually when you can hack one vendor and get them all? And it's not just software vendors. Any trusted service provider is a potential supply chain target. Cloud providers, email providers, payment processors, anybody who sits between companies and their customers or between companies and their operations. We're also seeing the proliferation of ransomware as a service. Criminal groups now operate like legitimate software companies. They develop ransomware, they lease it to affiliates, they provide technical support, they handle payment processing, they offer customer service to ransomware victims. It's franchising for cybercrime. This industrialization of cybercrime means attacks are getting more frequent, more sophisticated, and more damaging. Ransomware gangs pull in hundreds of millions of dollars annually. They can afford to hire talented developers. They can invest in research and development. They can buy zero-day exploits on the black market. And increasingly, we're seeing convergence between state-sponsored groups and criminal gangs. Russian intelligence agencies are known to provide intelligence to ransomware groups, pointing them toward high-value targets or providing information about vulnerabilities. In exchange, the criminal groups create disruption that serves Russian geopolitical interests while maintaining plausible deniability for the Russian government. It's a symbiotic relationship. The criminals get better intelligence and more lenient treatment from law enforcement in their home countries. The state gets deniable offensive capabilities. Everyone wins, except the victims. We're also seeing more prepositioning. State-sponsored groups are quietly infiltrating critical infrastructure networks, and establishing persistent access without immediately attacking. They're planting time bombs, building capabilities for future conflicts. If tensions escalate, if war breaks out, they already have access to power grids, water systems, transportation networks, communications infrastructure. The U.S. has discovered Chinese malware embedded in critical infrastructure systems, not actively doing damage, just sitting there, waiting. Russia has been found prepositioned in Eastern European infrastructure. Iran is in Middle Eastern networks. North Korea is everywhere they can reach. It's the digital equivalent of sleeper cells. They're already inside. The infrastructure you depend on every day might already be compromised. We just won't know until someone decides to activate those capabilities. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We're doing the same thing. U.S. Cyber Command and the NSA are certainly inside Russian, Chinese, Iranian, and North Korean networks. We have our own preposition access, our own time bombs, our own capabilities waiting to be activated if conflict escalates. This is the new reality of geopolitics. Countries are sitting inside each other's critical infrastructure, holding mutual hostage situations. Mutually assured digital destruction. It's Cold War logic applied to cyberspace, except there are way more players, way less transparency, and way fewer established rules about what's acceptable. And unlike nuclear weapons, which require massive infrastructure and are hard to hide, cyber weapons can be developed by small teams in secret. The barrier to entry for sophisticated cyber warfare is low and getting lower. Which brings us to the most terrifying trend, artificial intelligence in cyber warfare. AI can identify vulnerabilities faster than human analysts. It can generate polymorphic malware that changes itself to evade detection. It can write convincing phishing emails in any language. It can autonomously map networks and identify high-value targets. It can make real-time decisions about how to spread, what to encrypt, when to strike for maximum impact. We're not there yet. Current AI-powered cyber attacks are relatively crude, but the technology is advancing rapidly. Within a few years, we'll see malware that thinks, adapts, and strategizes at superhuman speed. Malware that can read through your emails to learn your communication style, and then craft perfect impersonation messages to your colleagues. Malware that can analyze your network architecture and automatically identify the optimal attack path. And when that malware is deployed by state-sponsored groups with unlimited resources, unconstrained by law or ethics, willing to cause global damage to achieve their objectives, what happens then? NotPetya caused $10 billion in damage with 2017 technology. What will 2027 technology enable? What about 2030? At this point, you might be feeling pretty helpless. Global cyber warfare conducted by nation-states with unlimited resources? Supply chain attacks you can't detect? AI-powered malware that thinks faster than humans? What can any individual or company possibly do against threats like that? Here's the thing. While you can't stop nation-state attacks single-handedly, you can make yourself a harder target. And in cybersecurity, being a harder target often means attackers move on to someone else. Let's start with the basics that would have prevented or limited NotPetya's damage. Patch your systems. I know, it sounds boring and obvious. But seriously, patch your damn systems. Enable automatic updates on your personal devices. If you're responsible for IT in an organization, implement a patch management process with defined timelines. Critical security patches should be deployed within days, not weeks or months. Test them on non-production systems first, sure, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. An imperfect patch deployed quickly is better than waiting for ideal conditions that never come. Segment your networks. For organizations, this is critical. Your accounting department doesn't need access to your engineering systems. Your guest Wi-Fi shouldn't touch your corporate network. Your Ukrainian office shouldn't have unfettered access to your global infrastructure. Segment by geography, by function, by security level. Yes, it's less convenient. Security and convenience are inversely related. Choose security. Implement proper backup systems. And I mean proper. Air-gapped backups that aren't connected to your network. Offline tape systems that malware can't reach. Cloud backups with immutable storage that can't be modified or deleted even if an attacker gets your admin credentials. And test your backups regularly. Schedule restoration drills. Make sure you can actually recover your data and that the process works as expected. Use multi-factor authentication everywhere. MFA stops most credential-based attacks cold. Even if attackers steal your password, they can't log in without the second factor. It's not foolproof. Attackers have ways around MFA, but it dramatically raises the bar. Train your people. Most attacks start with social engineering, phishing emails, fake phone calls, pretexting. Your employees are either your strongest security layer or your weakest link. Regular security awareness training, phishing simulations, clear reporting procedures for suspicious activity. Make security part of your culture, not an annual mandatory video everyone clicks through without watching. Bet your vendors. This is harder but crucial. Any software you install, any service provider you use, is a potential supply chain attack vector. Do due diligence. Ask about their security practices. Review their compliance certifications. Include security requirements in contracts. And monitor updates. If possible, don't automatically install software updates the moment they're released. Wait a day or two. Let other organizations be the canaries in the coal mine. If there's a compromised update, you'll hear about it quickly. For individuals, the steps are simpler but still important. Keep your devices updated. Use strong, unique passwords for every account, managed with a password manager. Enable MFA wherever it's offered. Be skeptical of unexpected emails, even from people you know. Think before you click. Back up important data to external drives that you disconnect when not in use. And here's something most people don't think about. Have a plan for when things go wrong. Because they will eventually. Either you'll be attacked, or a service you depend on will be compromised. What's your plan? How do you communicate with family or colleagues if email is down? How do you access money if your bank systems are offline? How do you run your business if your primary systems are destroyed? These aren't hypothetical scenarios. They happen regularly. NotPetya proved that even the world's most sophisticated companies with unlimited resources can be completely crippled. If it can happen to Maersk, it can happen to anyone. Resilience is about being able to function when your primary systems fail. Paper backups of critical information. Alternative communication channels. Cash reserves. Relationships with vendors who can help you recover. These things sound paranoid until you need them, and then they're invaluable. But let's zoom out from individual and corporate security to talk about the bigger picture, because NotPetya isn't just a cybersecurity story. It's a story about the world we've built and the vulnerabilities inherent in that world. We've created a globally interconnected civilization. Supply chains span continents. A car manufactured in Detroit contains parts from 40 different countries. Your smartphone was assembled in China from components made in Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and the US, using minerals from Africa and rare earths from South America. The coffee you drank this morning was grown in Ethiopia, shipped through Rotterdam, roasted in Seattle, and delivered to your local cafe by a logistics network spanning 3 continents. This interconnection creates incredible efficiency. It enables global trade at scales that would have been impossible 50 years ago. It allows specialization and optimization in ways that dramatically reduce costs and increase quality. But it also creates systemic fragility. A cyber attack in Ukraine shuts down chocolate factories in Australia. A compromised software update in Kyiv stops ships from unloading in Los Angeles. Everything is connected, which means disruption anywhere can cascade everywhere. We've optimized for efficiency at the expense of resilience. Just-in-time manufacturing means minimal inventory, which is great for cash flow but terrible when supply chains break. Centralized IT systems managed from headquarters are efficient but vulnerable. Global networks with free-flowing data enable collaboration but also enable malware propagation. Every efficiency we gain by connecting things creates a potential attack surface. Every optimization that eliminates redundancy also eliminates our margin for error. And here's the uncomfortable question. Is this sustainable? Can we continue operating a civilization where a single cyber attack can cause $10 billion in damage? Where state actors can wage economic warfare with impunity? Where critical infrastructure is constantly under attack by adversaries we can't deter or punish? Maybe we need to rethink our assumptions about how connected everything should be. Maybe some systems need to be isolated, even if it's less efficient. Maybe we need redundancy and backup systems, even if they sit idle most of the time. Maybe we need to accept that perfect efficiency makes us perfectly vulnerable. This isn't just about technology. It's about geopolitics and international norms. We need treaties governing cyber warfare the same way we have treaties governing nuclear weapons. We need consequences for countries that conduct attacks like NotPetya. We need international cooperation on attribution and response. But getting there requires countries to agree that cyber warfare has limits, and right now, nobody wants to limit their own capabilities. The U.S. doesn't want restrictions because we have sophisticated offensive cyber capabilities. Russia doesn't want restrictions because cyber warfare is a domain where they can compete with the West asymmetrically. China doesn't want restrictions because they're building cyber capabilities rapidly. Nobody wants to be the first to tie their own hands. So we exist in a state of unregulated cyber conflict. Countries attack each other constantly. Critical infrastructure is under siege. Companies are caught in the crossfire. And we all just accept this as the new normal. But normal doesn't mean acceptable. Normal doesn't mean sustainable. Just because something is common doesn't mean it's okay. The NotPetya experience should have been a wake-up call. It should have triggered fundamental conversations about cyber norms, about infrastructure security, about the limits of acceptable state behavior in cyberspace. We should have emerged from 2017 with new international agreements, with reformed insurance frameworks, with dramatically improved corporate security practices. We didn't. We looked at the $10 billion price tag, made some incremental improvements, and went back to business as usual. Which means we're due for another wake-up call. And the next one might be worse. Let's talk about what the next NotPetya might look like, because it's not a question of if, but when. We know state actors are developing more sophisticated cyber weapons. We know they're pre-positioned in critical infrastructure. We know they're less constrained by norms or fear of retaliation than they were before NotPetya. We know the technology is advancing rapidly. Put all that together, and the trajectory is pretty clear. The next NotPetya might target industrial control systems. Instead of encrypting computers, it might manipulate SCADA systems that control power grids, water treatment plants, natural gas pipelines, chemical factories. Stuxnet, the U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear program, proved you can use cyber attacks to cause physical damage to industrial equipment. Now imagine that concept weaponized and deployed indiscriminately. Power grids across multiple countries going down simultaneously. Not for hours, but for weeks or months because the equipment is physically damaged and replacement parts have to be manufactured and shipped. Water treatment plants failing, potentially releasing untreated sewage or failing to purify drinking water. Chemical plants losing control of reactions, potentially releasing toxic gases. Refineries shutting down, causing gasoline shortages. These aren't hypothetical scenarios. Cybersecurity researchers have demonstrated vulnerabilities in all these systems. State actors have been probing these systems for years. The capabilities exist. We're just waiting for someone to decide the geopolitical benefit of deploying them outweighs the risk. Or the next NotPetya might target financial systems, banking networks, payment processors, stock exchanges, clearinghouses. Modern finance is entirely digital. Money only exists as entries in databases. Transactions are electronic messages passed between systems. What happens if you corrupt those databases? What if you manipulate those messages? What if you destroy the systems that track who owns what? In 2016, hackers, suspected to be North Korean, stole $81 million from Bangladesh Bank by compromising their SWIFT terminal and sending fraudulent transfer messages. They tried to steal nearly $1 billion, but were stopped by a typo in one of the transfer requests that caused a bank to question the transaction. That was a heist targeting one bank. Now imagine a coordinated attack targeting multiple banks, exchanges, and clearinghouses simultaneously. Not to steal money, but to destroy the systems that track money, to corrupt ledgers, to create chaos in global finance. The economic damage could be incalculable. It might take months to untangle who owns what, which transactions were legitimate, how to restore confidence in financial systems. Or the next NotPetya might target communications infrastructure, cell networks, internet backbone routers, DNS systems, undersea cables. Cut communications and you cripple everything that depends on them, which in the modern world is basically everything. Businesses can't operate. Emergency services can't coordinate. People can't contact each other. It would be like NotPetya's supply chain disruption, but exponentially worse because it would affect every form of digital communication simultaneously. And unlike NotPetya, which was at least theoretically containable because it spread through networks you could isolate, attacks on infrastructure might not be stoppable once initiated. If someone destroys physical equipment or corrupts firmware and hardware devices, recovery could take an extremely long time. Here's another terrifying possibility: a multi-stage attack. Stage 1 looks like a standard ransomware attack. Companies focus on recovery, pulling out backups, rebuilding systems. But the backups are compromised too, seeded with malware that stayed dormant during backup creation. Stage 2 triggers after companies think they've recovered, reinfecting everything and destroying the backups that were supposed to save them. Companies that barely survive the first wave get hit again while they're vulnerable, pushing them into bankruptcy. Or imagine an attack that's designed to trigger physical effects, manipulating power grid systems to create cascading failures, altering industrial control systems in ways that cause equipment to fail or catch fire, manipulating traffic control systems to cause accidents, changing prescription information in hospital drug dispensing systems. These scenarios sound extreme, but they're all technically possible. The systems are vulnerable. The capabilities exist. The only thing holding back such attacks is restraint from state actors who possess these capabilities. And as we've seen, that restraint is eroding. Each major cyber attack that goes unpunished lowers the bar for the next one. Each attack that successfully achieves its objectives encourages copycats. We're in an escalatory cycle where attacks get bigger, bolder, and more destructive, and the international community has shown itself incapable or unwilling to stop the escalation. The next NotPetya might not come from Russia. China has sophisticated cyber capabilities. So does Iran. North Korea has proven itself capable of devastating attacks despite limited resources. And we can't discount the possibility of non-state actors, terrorist groups, or criminal organizations getting their hands on these tools and deploying them for their own purposes. The cyber weapons developed by nation-states don't stay exclusive for long. They leak, they get stolen, they get reverse-engineered. Eternal Blue, The NSA exploit that powered NotPetya was leaked by a hacking group and published online. Now anyone can use it. The same thing will happen with more sophisticated tools. Eventually, weapons-grade cyber capabilities will be available to anyone with the motivation and minimal technical skill. When that happens, when these tools proliferate beyond state control, the threat landscape becomes truly unmanageable. We might look back at NotPetya as the era when at least attacks came from sophisticated state actors with some rational constraints on their behavior, as opposed to the chaotic free-for-all that could emerge. Maybe you're thinking, okay, this is all terrifying, but what does it have to do with me? I'm not Maersk. I'm not running critical infrastructure. I'm just a regular person living my life. Here's why you should care. When NotPetya hit, you probably didn't notice. Maybe you saw some news headlines. Maybe you thought, that's too bad for those companies. And then you moved on with your day. Because NotPetya's impact on the average person was mostly invisible. But think about what almost happened. If Maersk hadn't recovered as quickly as they did, store shelves would have started emptying. The products you buy are shipped in containers. If containers can't move, products don't arrive. Maybe it's not an immediate crisis, but after a few weeks, after shelves stay empty, after prices spike due to shortages, you'd notice. If Merck's vaccine production had been offline longer, vaccine shortages would have gotten worse. Maybe your kid doesn't get their scheduled vaccination. Maybe schools require vaccines, but they're unavailable. Maybe an outbreak occurs because vaccination rates dropped. You'd notice. If FedEx had collapsed entirely, millions of small businesses that depend on shipping would have been affected. Maybe the online order you placed never arrives. Maybe the small business you support goes under because they can't ship products. The ripples spread in ways you wouldn't immediately connect to the original cyber attack, but you'd feel the effects. NotPetya caused $10 billion in direct damages. But the indirect effects, the economic slowdown from disrupted supply chains, the lost productivity, the delayed projects, the canceled contracts, those ripple through the economy in ways that eventually affect everyone. Maybe your company loses a client because that client was affected by NotPetya. Maybe your job security decreases. Maybe your retirement account takes a hit because companies you're invested in reported losses. It's all connected. And that was from a relatively contained attack that mostly affected large corporations with resources to recover. The next attack might not be so contained. It might hit infrastructure you depend on directly. Your power, your water, your communications, your access to money, your ability to work or shop or live normally. Cyber warfare isn't something happening in a distant realm that doesn't affect you. It's happening in the infrastructure you use every single day. Every time you turn on a light, make a phone call, withdraw money, drive on a road with traffic signals, receive medical care, you're depending on systems that are under active attack by adversaries who have proven their willingness to cause massive collateral damage. The question isn't whether another NotPetya scale event will happen. The question is when, and whether we'll be ready for it. And based on what we've learned from NotPetya, based on how little has fundamentally changed in the 6 years since, the honest answer is probably not. But awareness is the first step. Understanding the threat, understanding how interconnected and vulnerable our systems are, understanding that cyber warfare isn't abstract but concrete and immediate, that's essential. Because an informed public can push for better corporate security practices, better government policies, better international cooperation. Companies won't invest adequately in security unless customers and shareholders demand it. Governments won't take cyber warfare seriously unless citizens insist on it. International cooperation won't happen unless there's public pressure for it. So by learning about NotPetya, by understanding what happened and why it matters, you're taking the first step toward being part of the solution instead of just a passive victim waiting for the next attack. June 27, 2017. a date that should live in infamy alongside other technological disasters. The day a single line of malicious code proved that our interconnected world is far more fragile than we like to think. The day $10 billion in value evaporated because of a cyber attack most people never heard about. The day shipping stopped, pharmacies ran short of medicine, factories went dark, and the global economy shuddered from a weapon released by a nation-state with no fear of consequences. NotPetya was a wake-up call we collectively snoozed. We saw the devastation. We calculated the costs. We investigated, we attributed, we indicted. And then we basically went back to sleep, hoping it was a one-time event, an aberration, something that wouldn't happen again. But it will happen again. The question is not if, but when. And next time, we might not be so lucky. The world Maersk, FedEx, Merck, and hundreds of other companies woke up to on June 27, 2017, was forever changed. They learned painful lessons about supply chain security, about backup systems, about the fragility of global networks. They spent billions rebuilding, recovering, securing. But countless other organizations didn't learn those lessons because they weren't affected. They looked at NotPetya and thought, that won't happen to us. They saw the price tag and decided the risk wasn't worth the investment in prevention. They calculated that the odds of being hit were low enough to gamble. That's the same calculation people made about pandemic preparedness before COVID-19. That's the same calculation people made about cyber warfare before NotPetya. It's the same calculation that inevitably proves catastrophically wrong. Here's what I want you to take away from this story. NotPetya happened because of a convergence of factors: sophisticated state-sponsored attackers with advanced capabilities, a trusted software supply chain that was compromised, global networks that were interconnected without sufficient segmentation, companies that hadn't patched known vulnerabilities, backup systems that weren't properly isolated, and an international environment where cyber warfare operates without meaningful constraints. Every single one of those factors still exists today. We've made incremental improvements in some areas, but the fundamental vulnerabilities remain, which means the next NotPetya is just waiting for someone to decide to deploy it. Maybe you're in a position to make security decisions at your organization. Maybe you're a cybersecurity professional. Maybe you're a policymaker. Maybe you're just someone trying to protect yourself and your family. Whoever you are, you have a role to play in making our digital infrastructure more resilient. Learn from NotPetya. Don't wait for the next disaster to take security seriously. Don't assume it won't happen to you. Don't cut corners because proper security is expensive or inconvenient. The cost of prevention is always less than the cost of recovery. And sometimes recovery isn't even possible. And if you're someone who can influence policy, push for international cooperation on cyber norms. Push for consequences for state-sponsored attacks. Push for investment in critical infrastructure security. Push for regulations that require minimum security standards. The free market alone won't solve this problem because security is an externality that companies can ignore until they're attacked, and by then it's too late. The story of NotPetya is ultimately a story about consequences. The consequence of prioritizing efficiency over resilience. The consequence of interconnecting everything without securing those connections. The consequence of allowing cyber warfare to operate without rules or deterrence. The consequence of assuming that because something hasn't happened yet, it won't happen at all. But it's also a story of human resilience and ingenuity. The Maersk employees who rebuilt 49,000 computers in 10 days. The cybersecurity researchers who analyzed NotPetya and figured out how it worked. The companies that learned from the attack and improved their security. The investigators who tracked down the attackers and brought indictments even though those attackers will never face trial. We have the knowledge to build more secure systems. We have the technology to defend against these attacks. We have the capability to create international frameworks that punish aggressors and deter future attacks. What we've lacked is the collective will to prioritize these things before disaster strikes. NotPetya gave us a glimpse of what's possible when state actors decide to weaponize cyberspace against civilian infrastructure. $10 billion in damage. Global supply chains disrupted. Critical industries crippled. All from a single attack. The next one could be worse. Or we could finally learn the lessons NotPetya tried to teach us and build a more resilient, more secure digital infrastructure before it's too late. The choice is ours. The clock is ticking, and the attackers aren't waiting for us to figure it out. If you found this story eye-opening, if you think more people need to understand the invisible cyber war happening all around us, share this video. Subscribe to this channel because we're going to keep digging into the stories that shape our digital world, the hacks you never heard about, the vulnerabilities that should keep you up at night, the security failures that endanger us all. And leave a comment. Tell me what part of the NotPetya story shocked you most. Tell me what your company or organization is doing to prevent the next attack. Tell me whether you think international cyber warfare treaties are possible or if we're doomed to a free-for-all where anything goes. This conversation matters. The threats are real. The stakes are existential. And the time to act is now, before the next NotPetya rewrites history again. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there. And remember, in the digital age, the apocalypse doesn't announce itself with sirens and mushroom clouds. It arrives quietly, with a single line of code, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. Until next time.